wanted to have me here instead of Professor Habib. But as you know, Professor Habib fell ill while he was talking to you yesterday. And he called me around 10 in the morning saying that he won't be in a position to take the class today. But he said that since you all will be coming, therefore I should put into substitute for him. I know it's a very poor substitution, but at least you will not be going away because then the whole schedule will happen. But before that, there is an announcement before I begin talking about historiography. There is another announcement, and that is that I don't know how many of you will be interested in appearing in the test. Test is not compulsory, it's only for those who wish to get a certificate. The certificate will only be given to those who will be able to secure some particular percentage which Professor Habib will decide in the objective type. The test will be fully objective type. I think there will be something like 30 or 25 questions, and they will be exactly based on whatever he has discussed here or what I am trying to say today. I will tell you what I discussed. I will of course be keeping his synopsis and will try to follow that. So my request is, and then the test papers are to be prepared. So, and we generally do that in a series, 1, 2, 3, it's a separate. So even if you look around, you can't find out the answer from other person's notebook or test sheet. So I have requested the volunteer research scholars here, your seniors, to distribute a paper, and those of you who wish to appear in the test, please write down your names. So we will be having a rough idea how many are going to appear. Of course, if there are 50 who say they wish to appear in the test, we will certainly be preparing 75 sheets, test papers. And if someone at the last moment changes his mind and wish to appear in the test, of course all will not be, then it's not that if you have not given the name, you cannot come for the test, right? So we will be keeping some in addition to how many of you are going to sign. So, Inay Sahab aap party. So please just sign those of you who wish to go for
Salim bhai.
You want the synopsis? You want the synopsis? Salim, इधर synopsis नहीं है. वो तो बहुत उन्हीं ने तो पंडित जी ने तो 200 करके रखे. अच्छा, जाबिर साहब will also be extremely disappointed, but anyway, now you are here. This was the scheduled by Professor Habib. Today we will be discussing the historiography of the national movement. Up till now, you were discussing with him, or he told you, the whole course of national movement. I am not saying that he was only telling you the facts, because as we know, facts are not history. There is a difference between facts and history. Once facts are interpreted in a particular manner, they become history, right? So he gave you the history of the national movement, not the facts of the national. Of course, history cannot be without facts, and facts remains facts if they are not interpreted. So facts interpreted are history, right? So what you got is the, up till now, is the history writing of national movement, or history of the national movement. Today we are going to look at what are the different interpretations of the national movement. This is what is called historiography. How historians, different type of historians or different historians of different views, look at our national movement, how they try to interpret. So we will be beginning with the very early interpretation of the national movement, or very early history of the national movement. It will be the view of those who themselves were not only the contemporary but also the participant in the national movement, either on this side or on that side. Right? Those the imperialists who were opposing it, or the Indian nationalists who were launching the movement or carrying out the movement. So we will begin with their views first. So among them, we find that an interesting thing is that those who themselves were participating in the national movement or leading the national movement rather, not only participating but leading the national movement, they themselves were writing about it. They themselves wrote about it. Because unlike 1857, it was not an spontaneous thing. It was something which was thought of. It was something which was deliberate. It was an attempt which was conscious. There were already the preparations of all the types, not only for mobilization, but working out a whole agenda for what we should fight. Therefore, those who were the leading members of the national movement themselves were talking about it or preparing by their writings, preparing the grounds about it. So we have first to see how they were looking to national movement. What is their interpretation of it? What is their view of it? So one has to begin with Dadabhai Naoroji, who has written a large number of letters starting from 1871 onwards, which finally was published as a collection, The Poverty of India and the Un-British Rule. Right? It's a famous book which I am sure Professor Habib must have mentioned in the course of this study. Dadabhai Naoroji was looking at the movement, as it seems, if you read his letters, as a movement against the imperialists. The imperialists who were ruling the country for their sake and were not ruling it for the sake of those whom they were governing, whom they were ruling. It was for their own interest that they were ruling India or they were carrying out the Indian government. And therefore, the first grievance was the economic grievance. How they are draining the wealth away from the country and how this wealth is really used for the benefit of the so-called metropolitan or mother country by denying the same resources to people of India themselves and causing them great poverty. By the beginning of the 20th century or by the close of the 19th century, the awareness that there is an economic grievance, that there is an economic deprivation of the country was certainly well settled. It was not just felt, but it was getting some sort of expression as well. And it was not only the Indians who were doing it, Indian nationalists who were doing it, but it was also some of the Englishmen themselves who were not imperialists were ready to talk about it. So William Digby wrote the famous book. The title was a sarcasm. The title of the book was Prosperous British India. And on the title was given for a series of years the per capita income, how it is declining, giving it right at the time the British took over and bringing it year after year, 10 years after 10 years, decennial series, how the per capita income is declining. So the first idea was that India has to be seen in terms of a country which is modern terms, while how you judge today what is the condition of a country, you will say what is its GDP and what is the per capita income. Right? America, per capita income of America is so high, China is so much, of India is so much. So you judge the country, the performance of the government or performance of the state by the per capita income. So Digby was doing the same thing. So Dadabhai Naoroji And after Dadabhai Naoroji, and Dadabhai Naoroji in fact wrote, in a way to give voice to the tongueless. He was talking on behalf of the deprived poor peasants, on behalf of the Indian artisans who were losing their jobs. By now, it was already, from 1813, it was the English goods which were entering the Indian markets, competing with the Indian manufacturers, artisanal products, and driving them out. So it was now the artisans who were in a poor condition. It was the peasants who, after the settlements and all that, were deprived of the whatever was their surplus. And it was not only that, but as one can also see, which reflects on the nature of the national movement, there was now a rise of a real middle class in the real sense of the term. The rise of industries from 1870s onward, whether it is the jute industry in Bengal or whether it is the textile industry of Bombay and Surat. So it was now that the industrialists were also realizing, the cotton fabric makers were also realizing that there are countervailing duties. So that the English cloth should be able in a position to compete with Indian goods, Indian cotton goods. Because in India the cost of production was low. Once you started making by the mills, the labor is cheaper, cotton is your own, unlike Britain where it is imported from Egypt or from West Indies, earlier from India, and the wages in comparison to India, though not high, but in comparison to India the cost of production is higher. Then there is a cost of transport, so they couldn't compete with us. So there were countervailing duties. The Indian goods, if the British goods coming into India are paying a tax, a transit duty, Indian goods will also be paying a duty to keep the prices high, compatible with the English goods. So the middle class, middle class we generally say those people who are busy in carrying out professions other than agriculture, right? And the middle class is generally the one who is self-employed, self-dependent. So it is the merchants, the teachers, the say lawyers who earn their income by themselves, not depending upon others. So working class is separate from the industrial class. So it was now the idea that this middle class is really trying to spearhead a movement against this exploitation. What the national movement is, which we now are calling national movement, what the movement is for, is to see to it that English exploitation of all classes of Indians, because we said peasant and zamindars both, we said workers and industrialists both, we said artisans and all other classes should be resisted, right? Most of the people who were waging this movement themselves were Western educated, and they were all aware of the modern ideas of French Revolution, of equality, liberty and fraternity. So it was, the earliest interpretation was that as Dadabhai Naoroji's work and later on R.C. Dutt's own writings, he wrote two books. One was India under the early British rule and the other was India during the Victorian era. He was an ICS officer who has reached the highest position of becoming a commissioner of Odisha. But then he joined the Indian National Congress, became the president of the Indian National Congress, then resigned from services, went to London and took up a lecturership at SOAS, London, School of Oriental and Asian Studies, London. And it was there that sitting in the archives of the British government itself, He collected all the material. Of course, he has the first-hand knowledge of what's happening because he was holding a very high office in India itself, how the exploitation is going on. And he is the first who really used the word that decline of towns, decline of industries or manufacturers. Now, anyone who is reading Modern India talks of drain of wealth, deindustrialization, deurbanization. But it was he who gave the real meaning and real description of these, and using more cautious words as a historian, calling it decline of towns and decline of manufacturers, because these were really not the industries, these were the artisanal product. So both Dadabhai Naoroji and R.C. Dutt, since were raising the economic grievances of the people, the economic grievances are same for all, to whatever community, to whatever caste, to whatever religion you belong. They were all affected to different degrees. The peasant might be much more affected rather than the industrialist. Industrialists are only having less profit while the peasants were starving, famished. But the economic grievances were common. So for both of them, Dadabhai Naoroji and R.C. Dutt, it was a movement of all the peoples of country led by the middle class intelligentsia, which was handful but which was more aware of the situation, not leaving it to the doings or rather the will of God, or not thinking that it is their own and they will get the reward in the other world, but really realizing what it is. So this was rather the first, Dadabhai Naoroji's book, Un-British Rule, Poverty of India and Un-British Rule. Both were careful enough not to really take issues with the British government, and therefore they were saying it is the un-British. Because what is the expectation from a modern state now? The modern state should bring or should work for the welfare of the people, for the improvement of the living conditions of the people. Since it is just the other way around, therefore it is the un-British in India. It's not really, if it would have been British, it would have been the other way around. The second type of interpretation or second phase of interpretation which comes of Indian national movement, or the next type of history which we get, comes from the second generation of the Indian national leaders, Gandhiji himself and Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. And we will be finding what the difference here is, even between the two, but how Gandhiji is different from R.C. Dutt and Dadabhai Naoroji for certain points. Gandhiji wrote two famous things. One is Hind Swaraj, which he wrote on his way from London to South Africa in 1909. Hind Swaraj is a book which, according to Gandhiji, while his patron saint Gokhale read, was aghast and said, "What nonsense are you talking?" But while it was reprinted in his lifetime and permission was sought, he allowed it to be permitted as it was, while his views, as we will be seeing, were different now. And while people asked, friends like Nehru and others asked, why you are allowing it reprint in the same form, he said, "I am after truth, not after consistency." That is, my views are evolving, changing. What were my earlier views should be known to everybody, and what are my now views, because I am after truth. I am trying to reach the actual facts. I am not a dogmatic that if I once thought of one thing, I am not going to change my view. In Hind Swaraj, what he did was, it was an scathing criticism of the British in India, and it was a glorification of ancient, or rather Indian religious traditions. His source for these religious traditions were not only Bhagavad Gita, but also Quran. He was trying to invoke those values which he interpreted are present or which he assumed are present in Bhagavad Gita and in Quran. They may or may not be there. One is not really saying. It was his interpretation of Bhagavad Gita and Quran. He tried to found, so the modern ideas, the sorts of modern values which he wanted here to be implemented, the source was not French Revolution or European civilizations, but he was trying to find them in India. So in Bhagavad Gita, he trying to find that his own interpretation of Indian values, that the religion talks of tolerance of all other religions. I don't know whether it is there in Bhagavad Gita or not. It talks of peace and equality. It talks of duty of the rulers to provide all benefits to the subjects. One is not sure, I'm nobody to interpret Gita, but this is how he was interpreting it. And of all, he also found that Quran talks of peace and no jihad. So you can very well see that it was a wishful interpretation of the religious text which Gandhiji wanted there to be, and he interpreted that Quran is also talking that there should be peace with all and there should be and there should be an equality among people. And he found that the worst thing which the British did was to bring out women, Indian women, out of the household, to bring them in the open, to try to give them education, to try to give them rights. This is the worst thing which the British are doing about India. So you can very well realize that, as he said, I'm not after consistency. He changed his views later on, as to which I'll be coming while I'll be talking about presently about my experiment with truth. So for Gandhi in the beginning, it was a movement again for all, because Quran and Bhagavad Gita both are there for giving the values. So for all Indians, irrespective of their religion, a movement which was bringing them all together and asking them to fight for their rights. Soon enough, he wrote my experiments with truth over a long time. And along with that, his policies and actions started talking of something else. You know how dichotomy was there in Gandhi, you can really find out. He will keep on saying, I am a Sanatan Dharmi. You know, Sanatan Dharmi as against Arya Samajis. I am a Sanatan Dharmi. I am a Sanatani Hindu. And all along his life, about which we know, and my experiment with truths, you will not find any information, any evidence that he has ever visited a temple or prayed in a temple. He is a Sanatan Dharmi who never goes to the... So even Arya Samajists have their own type of place of worship, but Sanatan Dharmi are supposed to be following this all. So his terms were rather different. He now started from 1923 onwards, bringing women out of their household themselves. His constructive program, I'm sure Professor Habib would have mentioned with you, was really manned by women alone. Which is the wrong word to use, man, one should say woman, because it was only and only women in that movement, and those women were uneducated women from villages who were the part-time spinners who were spearheading the entire movement. And then afterwards you find that the important sessions of the Indian National Congress are presided over by Sarojini Naidu, Vijayalakshmi Pandey, and many others. Of course, I am not here to, that must have been discussed earlier. But there remained an attempt to keep everyone together. So whatever you do, you do not proclaim it. You do not say you stand for the equality of gender, but you start treating women equal to men. Similarly, while he was talking in 1924, the Untouchability Conference, such a scathing attack on untouchability. He dined with all whom he now gave the name Harijan, which now are called Dalit. He gave a better name Harijan, the people of God. But at the same time, he said, I am not asking others to interdine or to intermarry. If you are moving or if you are trying to make a united front, you have to pay attention to the sentiments of all. So you yourself is ready to interdine, but you are not forcing others to do that. That is the reason why it became possible for him to bring the zamindars and the peasants, workers and the industrialists together in the national movement. But not for the sake of industrialists and zamindars, but for the sake of the peasant and the workers. Right? That was rather the most tricky thing for him to manage. Who financed, of course, even Dadabhai Nauroji was financed, he was given money by the industrialists. And what he was talking all the time in Britain was the poverty of the working class, not of the industrialists. He was not saying that there should not be countervailing duties. He was only talking that the drain of wealth is bringing the people, the living standards so low and what's happening to the poor. Similarly, Gandhi was getting all donations from Birlas and from all other industrialists, but working for the sake of the poorest of the poor. So, Gandhiji called his own national movement, gave it his own term, Sarvodaya. It is the upliftment of all, Sarvodaya. Udaya means serve. So it is the improvement or upliftment of all. It was not an in all, you can also include really if there are a middle class, which also requires to be uplifted. So, in that manner, Gandhiji gave it a form of a united front, but his insistence up till the end remained that the values of these modern values, which we are calling modern values, are the real Indian values. And therefore, he is not ready, if there are any detractors to what he thinks are the real values, they have their own values, they can continue with that. No quarrel with them. So, united front can only be formed that you are joining hands on a minimum program. So, the minimum program is to overthrow the British. And therefore, you are ready to accept other type of disagreements. As against that, Nehru was just diametrically opposite to Gandhi. He was a firm believer in rationality and reason and has nothing to do with religion. His idea was, if you need a religion, please do have it. I don't need one, I don't have one. So, it's a very clear thing. He wrote 3 works. First was the Glimpses of World History. Second was the autobiography. And the third was Discovery of India. Gandhiji also wrote his autobiography, My Experiments for Truth. But there is only one thing common between Nehru and Gandhi's autobiography. The scathing self-criticism. Gandhi is also as self-critical as Nehru is only criticizing himself. These are not self-serving autobiographies where you generally find persons saying, I did everything and I achieved everything. I never committed a mistake. Here, both the leaders of the national movement are the other way around. I am committing a Himalayan blunder. That is Gandhi's famous words. Nehru, I didn't have the courage to argue it out with Bapu. Right? So there is self and a scathing self-criticism you will find. But now there is a widening of the interpretation of the national movement. Glimpses of World History, all the three books were written in prison. Glimpses of World History was written while he was imprisoned during the first phase of the civil disobedience movement, 1930 to 33, where he directly, it is in the form of letters to his daughter, young daughter, whom he was trying to teach world history, and along with world history, many other values in life. And he writes himself at the end that the reason why he is printing them, that it was his exercise or an attempt to place Indian national movement in the world context. You know, Nehru was writing while Russian Revolution was already there. You know, it was the time of Stalin, 1930s. Lenin was already dead. It was the time while the early phases of Chinese Revolution were taking place. Kuomintang and others were already there. So he wanted to put, and he was not only confining to contemporary or to the revolution which occurred in the 20th century, but in earlier times. So he was as much interested in looking what were the peasant wars in Germany, or what was the French Revolution like, or what was the tussle for coming out of the feudal system, or the peasant wars. So all that was the background. So Indian national movement has to be placed into the context of the world movement. Similar, not exactly similar, but for similar causes. When there were a revolution for the sake of the people against the rulers, from English Revolution down to French Revolution and particularly to Russian Revolution. Autobiography, as I have said, was really written in the context of the national movement. Nehru is hardly talking about himself, he is only giving you the history of the national movement, what's happening when. And he only comes into the picture when he is committing a mistake, or when he is losing temper. That is the only times while he himself appears in his pages. Otherwise, it is the story of the national movement, where it is very, very clearly an anti-imperialist measure or movement. His refusal to meet Mussolini while he was passing through Italy, and the way he is saying that why he refused to do so. So you can find from his visit to Russia, to Soviet Union, all those descriptions, whether within India or outside, are totally different, putting it into an international struggle against the imperialism. And imperialism, while you are attacking imperialism, you are coming very close to socialism, because imperialism combines with capitalism. So it was again a very interesting problem for him at two levels, which he describes, and then you can see how national movement is really being interpreted by him. One is that he wishes India to get industrialized, and at the same time he is against capitalist. So you can see the dichotomy. The other problem is Gandhiji's espousal of the cause of the domestic industries and his hatred of industrial revolution. Gandhi was, as you know, dead set against industrialization. He wanted only cottage industries. So at two fronts he is facing it, how to bring about a change, which is, and another very interesting thing in Nehru was, which was the part of the national movement, which was so different from the 1857, that there was an attempt to clarify the ideas after independence, what would be India like. You first make a plan. I'm sure Professor Habib must have discussed in detail 1931 Karachi resolution with you. So Nehru is now in a dilemma to look at India in what form, and there he comes very close to the left. I'm not saying to the communists, I'm saying to the left, and to what he called socialism. He was generally called the representative of the left in the Indian National Congress. Discovery of India, which was written in 1935 to 36, was different, but only one thing which brings us closer to the national movement was his way of describing the history of the country from the earliest time and trying to emphasize that the country, at least even if it was not really a nation, at least has some concept of oneness. It may not be in the modern terms the nation, but it is, and that was achieved according to him, the two best rulers of the country, Ashok and Akbar. And he pays homage to both, and you know it was he who selected all the emblems of Ashok for our Indian, whether it is the flag or whether it is the coin or whether whatever it is, but also Akbar. And how closely he is following as a not as a, almost as a professional historian the sources. He says that Jesuits' criticism of Nehru is Akbar is that he is a man who is befooling everyone by saying that he treats or he tolerates all religions. In fact, he is treating none by treating all equal. By treating all, by tolerating all, he is in fact violating all. And he is an atheist who only believes in values which are human, not or rational or based on reason, not on superhuman. And he, after writing this criticism of Akbar, he writes the next sentence: I wish all Indians should have been atheist like Akbar. Atheist like Akbar. So his idea was that India, it was not that the attempt to overthrow British which made India a nation or which brought the people together. This concept, this idea of India in an embryonic form was already there. It might have been undermined over time, but from Mauryan period to coming of the, from Akbar onward, all over the Mughal period, it was the concept which was already there. We and they was already there. So that was another view which was of the contemporary. Gandhi's view was, as he said, that it was a united front, and Nehru in a way partly followed that, while and as Gandhiji afterwards wrote in his My Experiments with Truth, was that I am ready even to accept the communist ideas, however distasteful they might be to me. Right? So this was perhaps some sort of an indication on what line Nehru was taking the country and the national movement. It was from there one finds that immediately after the independence of the country, after almost on the verge of the independence, what were the views? One view which was very close to the time, from 1940 to 1946, was that of R.P. Dutt, the Marxist interpretation of Indian national movement. They were fighting or they were doing anything for their own sake. They were doing it for the sake of the people of the country. This much concessions or this much admission is already there. But his main grievance was that the leadership is in the hands of the Indian bourgeoisie, not into the hands of the people or the peasant, but it is in the hands of the bourgeoisie. His other admission rather was that the left movement is a part of the Indian national movement. It is a part of the Indian national movement because, you know, there were not the leaders who could, in fact, as I have already said, Nehru was supposed to be the real spokesman of the socialist ideas in the national movement. So R.P. Dutt was rather only criticizing the leadership. The tussle was for the leadership, but he was certainly appreciating the national movement as a united front which was working for the sake of the people. Unfortunately, the latter Marxist historiography has some other views, particularly not exactly the historians writing, but others who wrote. E.M.S. Nambudri looked at it as if the Marxist or the left movement for independence of the country is going on parallel to the national movement, which really was not the fact. There was very little difference between the left and the Indian National Congress at that time. So it is right that it was not a movement of the working class, but at the same time, or of the peasant, but it was certainly a movement which was for the working class and for the peasant and all others. We have now to look at the Indian side of the interpretation of national movement, the contemporary, and immediately afterwards, we may now look at the British. The British view were of two types. One was represented by Dufferin, Curzon, and later on by Simon, Irwin and Simon. This view was that it is the problem of the British Empire in India that by perforce they have to create a middle class, an educated, Western educated middle class in India. For doing all the jobs, they couldn't employ or bring people from England because the cost of running the government will be too high, their salaries being too high. So earlier, they started creating what is generally called baboons, from which the word babu comes. You know, today even all the clerks are called babus, and we will say there is a babu mentality. They create problems and they simply go on what the rules are without really understanding them. So baboon is that type of a monkey who is very good at imitating. So the British wanted the Indians, as they themselves said, who should be in appearance, even in appearance, British, but at heart Indians. So in appearance they should only follow. It is generally said that what Mukherjee writes, Banerjee understands. The English officers themselves won't understand what is written, but the Indian subordinates will be understanding that English and will be doing accordingly. So it was their view, Dufferin's view was, and so was that of Curzon. One was in 1884 to 88, Dufferin, that it was the British created middle class which is now trying to claim some sort of a position of being the representatives of the Indian for themselves. Representatives of the Indian, because both Curzon's time was 1899 to 1904, even after the second appointment, and that of Dufferin was 1884 to 88. You know, it was much before the Jallianwala Bagh or the mass mobilization of the national movement. So their view was that they wished to be understood or to be taken as the representatives of the Indian people, this middle class whom we have created, and they wanted to claim certain privileges on that level. As against that, there was another view which was represented in a book called Rise and Fulfillment of the British Rule in India, which came out later in 1934 by Thompson and Garrett. This was that it was rather a sort of a further extension of the white man's burden. The Europeans or the British came to India to civilize us, and they have now fulfilled the mission of making us modernized and civilized, and we have now come up of age when we can claim our government by ourselves. So it is the rise and fulfillment of the British India, British rule in India. So rule was not It was rather a sort of a negation that to say, or Dadabhai Naoroji, that the British rule is for the good of the British, not for the good of India. So it was a reply, it was for the good of the Indians. We, of course, to learn you have to suffer, you have to have patience and you have to face problems. But now with that you have reached a level and it will be a fulfillment when India becomes independent, and British, after accomplishing a very noble task or objective, go back to Britain. This continued, of course, as I have said, but the earlier views, which was that of Dufferin and Curzon, continued in Irwin and Simon Commission's report. Simon Commission reports tried to look at the Indian national movement with a more austerity. It said it is not the movement of the all middle classes, educated middle class or the elite. It is the movement of the high caste Hindus. High caste Hindus. And therefore it is very narrow in nature and it is not a united front and it is not representing anyone else. Of course, this was the time when they already started experimenting with Muslim League and with all other ideas of the double franchise and all that. It was immediately after the independence that two new versions or new historiographical theories came about the Indian national movement. Almost immediately they started coming. This was the communal interpretation, following from Simon and Irwin, not even from say Thompson and Garrett. One was R.C. Majumdar's the Vidya Bhavan series, where it was rather the view of the Hindu Mahasabha, which R.C. Majumdar was trying to put, but with much fineness as a historian, remaining very correct with the facts. It was only the interpretation which go vary. Where he tried to look at it, that it was India which was a country, a slave country for thousands of years. I don't know, of course he was a historian, not a mathematician. Therefore he counted it thousands of years. One doesn't know from which year, maybe from the Kushanas he might be counting, because they also came from outside, or even from the Aryans themselves who came from outside. If only coming from the outside means that the rulers are outside, foreigners. So that was one view, and it was that it was therefore the partition was good to get rid of the other side. The rulers were now shown the door. They might have taken a piece of the country, but it was at least a good riddance. This was the type of interpretation. Equally naive and perhaps stupid was the version which the Pakistanis started coming with. This was the other work which was inspired by the Muslim League, and where the journal editor was I.H. Qureshi, someone who left the St. Stephen's, where he is still celebrated, and every year you have a I.H. Qureshi memorial lecture. So, who went to Pakistan and became the ideologue of the historians. It was the freedom struggle of Pakistan. The difficulty with the freedom of struggle of Pakistan can be now summed up in one sentence which recently Dawn has published from a reader. It said that in Pakistan's struggle or revolution was unique in the world. At all other places, people fought against the rulers. Here, it was among the fellow countrymen, against the fellow countrymen. Of course, the Muslim League was not fighting. The British, they were very loyal to the British. So they were not fighting against the British, they were fighting against the fellow countrymen. It's a Pakistani writing recently in Dawn, which the Journal of the Pakistan Historical Society, without coming reproduced. So that version of course remained very rather a troublesome version, because the problem is from where the Pakistan should begin. Pakistan comes into being after independence. So you can have a story or a history of the creation of Pakistan. You cannot have one for freedom struggle in Pakistan. There was no Pakistan earlier. So they remained in problem all the time. Sometimes they consider that Harappan civilization is theirs. Sometimes they simply disown it. So an unnatural partition which occurred made the historical proposition also difficult. Then there was the mainstream nationalist historiography. This historiography was in a way supported by Government of India, or particularly by Jawaharlal Nehru. Tarajan was given the task to write a reply to Vidya Bhavan series. Nehru was well aware of the fact that a misrepresentation of the Indian history, particularly that of the national movement, is going to have a telling effect on the future of the country. Therefore, what is required is an accurate version of the Indian national movement. So Dr. Tarajan was asked to prepare a work on freedom struggle in India, which he did in 4 full volumes. Interestingly enough, they are quite critical of Congress from time to time. They are not simply written, these volumes are written by a historian with a conscience who is knowing the laws of the rules of the game, who is not ready to compromise historical correctness or adherence to evidence with any other motive, how noble it might be, as noble as the unity of the country. So he is quite about everything. He writes a book in 4 volumes, where also he really looks at it that it was a composite culture already there, as Tagore started talking of from 1911 onwards. India was not belonging to any particular people of any particular religion. There were, and it was the modern thought which already had its influence on India. It was the social reform movement which gave further oneness to India. Was it not Raja Ram Mohan Roy who said India can never become a nation as long as the caste system remains? So all these ideas were already embodied in the national movement, and it was not only the ideas where the Arya Samaj or the Brahmo Samaj were to be there, but there were ideas which were totally atheistic in national movement. Henry Vivant Reggio, total rationalism, where they were celebrating beef eating, forcing others to be beef eater, the Bengal Bhadralok. So it was a totally different sort of a movement. There were direct criticisms of Gandhiji, though mild, as he is coming out with a criticism of Gandhi for signing the agreement after the second round table conference, where Hindu Mahasabha was also a signatory. So an intolerance for these sort of ideas, and if these mistakes were committed even for a person or a leader none less than Gandhiji, these are to be recorded by the historian. He might have his own views, but historians and others have a right to disagree. So that might be one of the more balanced work of history as far as the nationalist historiography is concerned. Here the debate is rather that what was the character of the Indian national movement, and attempt to show that it was really a nationalist character. There might be some digressions and the there is rather a very sympathetic description of the Muslim League or the partition of the country. Even the partition of country has been dealt with much care, but no compromise on facts. Not blaming anybody, but stating the facts. Trying even to say that perhaps Jinnah himself was not serious about the partition, as he himself said that we were using it as a bargaining counter. The demand for Pakistan was a bargaining counter. We never realized that the British are really out to do it. But they have done it in Ireland already, and they knew that how the people will keep on fighting against each other and they will be able to have their day. So both will become the members of the Commonwealth, where everything is common except the wealth. So that is how they are dealing with that. So all that was there. The latter Marxist historians like Bipin Chandra and Professor Irfan Habib himself has a different, both have a different attitude. Bipin Chandra rather emphasizes that the Congress was really representing the left view as, and he goes to the extreme. Then it is not the left view represented in the Congress, but it is Congress which itself becomes left. That is the problem. But Professor Irfan Habib's interpretation, which the book you might have seen already, some of you might have taken, where all his articles are there, is looking at it in a different manner. Even if he is writing about Gandhiji or Nehru or civil disobedience movement, there is an attempt to look how it was within the Marxist, say, framework, how far the state and the material forces were seen differently. What was the role assigned to the state? And who were the real beneficiaries? Who were supposed to be the real beneficiaries? So the description is rather much more balanced in his account. But besides that, there started more, one might say, influential movement, both on the side of the imperialists and on the side of the Indians themselves. I will take two of them quickly to leave some time for discussion. One is by a class which calls it revisionist or iconoclast. Iconoclast means that you are breaking all the icons. No one is great. What you suppose they are, the gods are to be broken. Among that first comes the Cambridge School, Jack Gallagher and Anil Seal. Here, Anil Seal, the best representative of this school of thought would be Anil Seal's book, Emergence of Indian Nationalism. Here, what is the emphasis is that the movement was only that of the elite class. It was the elite class, and he would not be using the class, rather he would be simply saying the elites. It is not the middle class, but the elites. Ridden with allegiance to their caste and community. There were elite who have their own home constituencies, the community or the, say, their caste with which they have allegiance, and they were really utilizing, using or misusing the others, the lower classes or the masses of the people for their own sake. It was also not an attempt to improve the conditions of the people of India, which, as we have seen right from Dadabhai Nauroji down to R.P. Dutt, all are agreeing with, but it was to serve the interest of their own, serving their own interest. The leaders were selfish enough, they were out to serve their own interest and to earn the interest of their community or their caste, not for anything else. They were taking a leaf rather from the work of Simon and others. It was, and their real engine moving was the Congress, and they were really, there was a competition, internal competition among them all. So up till now we were talking of a united front, all coming together. First, rather a sort of a concept of what is the greatest contradiction. There might be many other contradictions between the mill owners and the mill workers, peasants and the zamindars and all that, but the greatest contradiction now is British rule. So British imperialism is to be thrown. That was what the idea of the Congress was. They say it was not the idea at all. There was an attempt to, by asserting their power, individuals wanted to assert their power and to gain more favors from the British for themselves and for their followers. So it was not a united front, it was totally a different story, which of course reminds you of the Simon Commission. There was no exploitation by the British at all. Therefore, the question of the economic deprivation of the country is not to be discussed, not to be seen. And what he says very interestingly is, India was too large and too unrewarding a country or a colony for Britain. Too large and too unrewarding. So it was not Britain who was exploiting us, it was India which was exploiting Britain, because we were an unrewarding colony to govern it, to educate us, to give us modern values. The white men burden was going on and it was now becoming unmanageable. So it was the British who gave us independence because it was becoming too tiresome to carry this load along. It was not the efforts of the Indians or the Indian National Congress or the Indian freedom fighters which forced them to leave it. So that is rather a very interesting way of looking at that. And then another interesting thing which Anil Seal does is that he only looks at the official resolutions of the Indian National Congress. His entire work is not based on what was really happening in the country, what were the utterances of the people, what the newspapers are saying, what are the views of the common people and others. No, nothing. Only the official resolutions of the Indian National Congress which are seen and from which the objectives of the national movements are to be determined. And therefore they say that they were all, they were a very small minority, educated minority, which was trying to carry on their allegiances of caste and community, but to curry favor with the British for themselves. They were never ready to look at anything other than that. How, of course, we say that some in the beginning they might be having the allegiances with caste and community, like Gandhiji himself, as I have discussed. But how they transcended, how they changed over time, that is not reflected over there. The limit is that while they come to the civil disobedience movement and all that, the whole thing and what happened afterwards, 1936 election, and how the Congress ministries and one or two Muslim League ministries were formed. This was all attributed. Can I carry my voice up till the right? Then don't bother. So it was all attributed to the Act of 1935, which gave right to franchise to 30 million odd Indians and autonomy to the provinces, making them the real object of lust for the leaders, and therefore now the Congress ministries and others formed. So this is height of the, what you may say, diversity, how Anil Seal is trying to look at, or the Cambridge school is trying to look, because he is the first and then others follow this suit on the Indian national movement. There is nothing like the Gandhian mass movement, Indian masses participating. This was all, if this has happened, it was not because of Gandhiji or because of anything else. It was because of the British gave in 1935 the franchise and made the provincial governments a prized commodity. That so far is Cambridge school. Then you have an offshoot of the Cambridge school in India itself. That is the subaltern stockings. They really feel bad when one says that there is hardly any difference between them and the Cambridge school. But unfortunately, the greatest admirer of them, Edward Said, has also written finally that with their interpretation, they are becoming closer and closer to the Cambridge school's interpretation. The subaltern, what they are doing is nothing new. There is already, or what Ranjit Guha is trying to do, their topmost leader or historian, is nothing new. There was always an attempt to study the peasant and the workers' movement. And it was already realized that the movement, if they are coming from below, their nature is different. The difference in their nature is that most of the time they are spontaneous. They are not well thought of, because the primitive people or the workers cannot think of there is something which will ignite the whole movement altogether. They are the movement of the traditional people. They are more radical in nature, and their methods are more radical, and they are generally more violent. It was long ago that Hobsbawm wrote a whole book on primitive rebels. It was no new news for any one of us. The vocabulary they have taken was also coming from Gramsci, who wrote in prison like Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, his prison note and print. And since he was in prison, he cannot use the words proletariat, so he used for them the word subaltern. He couldn't use the Marxism as a word, and he called it theory of action. So of course they forgot about theory. Ranjit Guha forgot about theory of action, is no more Marxist. What he did was that he took the word subaltern from there, and he gave it a totally different meaning. Not the meaning which was there assigned to it by Gramsci, not the meaning which is there in the dictionary, that they are the uncommissioned officers in an army. But his subaltern were those who have the autonomy of their mind, thought. Those who have not influenced, or rather their ideas have not been corrupted by modern ideologies or modern values of equality, liberty, fraternity, and all that. So you have to celebrate those who is still stuck to their older allegiance and unreasoned and irrational. And those who are not mentally prepared to do anything but spontaneous revolts. And of course they are not going to be successful ever. So Professor Fanabi once wrote that the subalterns unfortunately will always remain the narrators of tragedies. Because whatever movement is going to come by subalterns, it is going to end in a fiasco. So they said that, and then there was another problem for them. For them, a factory worker is an elite because he is a part of a trade union, he knows his rights, he knows he is exploited, and he has accepted the mental hegemony of the other classes, the higher classes or the elite. While a zamindar or a raja who has all the money and exploiting all others but has nothing to do with modernity, he is a subaltern because he has not accepted the hegemony of the ideology of the elites. So the whole problem is that you do not know whom to support. If of course you will ask me that I should celebrate the Rajas and the Zamindars and side with them, I will find it a very difficult proposition. But this is how the subalterns put it. And therefore they tried to argue out that the Indian national movement was a tussle between the Indian elites and the colonial elites. There was nothing different between the two. The colonial elite means the imperialists, the British, and the Indian elites, that is the leaders of the Indian National Congress or national movement, who wanted, because they have now got the fully equipped to be the rulers and to be the exploiters, so they wanted to get the rule to themselves and to have the colonial or the imperial elite out. The word they use is colonial elite out, and to have the Indian elite in their place. Of course, what one will say, a very disgusting interpretation of the Indian national movement. The last, which I will say only 2 minutes, is the postmodern attitude towards Indian national movement. The very word postmodern is smack of something else, that they do not agree with the modern values. Modern values, the source of which is the French Revolution. So the concept of, says, universality of manhood, the equality of gender, of liberty, of tolerance, all are alien to their thought. Postmodernists say that this is also an attempt by others to take control of the minds of masses of the people. Therefore, they do not want history to be written. Indian national movement cannot be seen as one movement. It has to be seen movement by different people for different reasons, and at times British might be more correct in their position rather than those who were fighting. So in that way it is generally thought of, because postmodernism is really a gateway to what we today have, the globalization of economy. It's the globalization of ideology or thought as well. Like in the globalized market, you are not concerned with what is really good for others and what is bad. You only go for advertisement. There are so many products in the market. You are the judge to find one and take it one for yourself. The one who can befool you better, tell you can become overnight fair from dark. I don't know what is good in being fair. That's beside the point. That is up to you. Similarly, you should have so many versions of the national movement, at Santhals at one point and others at one point, and the Orthodox Muslims or the Fakirs at one point and all others. And it is your choice now in a capitalistic market of history to select your brand or your choice. Thank you very much for the patience hearing. I have left you only, I believe, 12 minutes, but will be more than happy to have questions. Yes, I have found one hand raised.
Although, and it was explained by you aptly in this lecture, that there are different interpretations of Shireen, and today it was Indian national movement. And there is no coincidence in it. Rather, it is a conscious attempt by historians of how they are put together school of thought. And by doing this, I feel we don't get a true picture of history. Rather, we get a colored picture. And is it possible for a historian to be neutral and to give a holistic view of events rather than interpretation? And I believe that...
But how you interpret the facts, you are free to do that. Right? And that's why you have so many versions of this. So many versions of not only national movement but Akbar. To some of us, Akbar will be is admirable because of his policy of tolerance. You go over across the border and it will be Aurangzeb who will be the hero and Akbar who will be the villain. Right? But none of them is twisting the fact. They like what Aurangzeb did and we like what Akbar did. They are not saying Akbar did something else rather than what he really did. Clear?
My question is just related to the facts that you have represented. In fact, you have stolen my turn. And before that, I would tell you that Iqbal has also supported Akbar. And Javed Iqbal has written in his biography. And he was a big fan of it. So what I am asking that you raise that particular question. Whether and how the British rational historians see this fact and up to what extent they are. And I would like to know your particular opinion on it.
Right. I'll first make